Afternoon. All right, so I know that I am the only thing standing between you and lunch. So this is going to be pretty fast. I've got 82 slides to cover in 45 minutes. Seriously. All right, so I'm me. I'm here. I've done stuff. I have scar tissue to prove it. Why are you guys here today? Well, you're going to learn a little bit about the internet, some basic history and cartography. I'm going to give you some statistics and trends and pretty pictures. You're going to get a sense of how things work and scale on the internet. I'm going to try to answer the question in the title of the presentation, and hopefully we'll have time to answer some of your questions if you have any at the end of the presentation. So, what's the internet? Global telecommunication system that is seemingly essential to modern life? Question mark? Seems pretty essential to me. An internet is a collection of computer networks. The internet, note the capital I, is the network of networks, and I am a stickler for the capital I. I know, like the AP style guide says, you don't have to capitalize internet anymore. They are wrong. So that is the internet as a whole, the global collection of networks. It's a collection of networks that all use a common protocol suite to interoperate. So how many of you guys here remember using dial-up internet by show of hands? Wow, okay, so we have some veterans. So how many of you cannot remember a time where there was not the internet? Okay. On the age divide, as usual. Anybody here professional network engineer who does BGP stuff? Yay! All right. Correct me if I'm wrong. All right. So we really know what the internet is. It's a series of tubes, and they're mostly full of cats. True story. Sadly, this is the only meme slide you're going to get in this talk. All right. So if you want to get on the internet, you're a residential or a small business customer, you have to buy the internet from an internet provider of some sort. Probably your cable TV company or your local phone company. Maybe it's satellite if you're very unfortunate out in nowhere. And in any case, you're buying it from some sort of vendor, and by definition, an ISP sells access to the internet. Incidentally, also to their own network, but it's really the internet. So the internet service provider has to connect to the internet in order to sell it to you. So how do they do that? So to explain that, we go back to the beginning. So before there was the internet, there was the ARPANET, and probably many of you have heard of this. It's funded by the United States Department of Defense, came into existence in '69 through 1990, used a totally different protocol called NCP. This would be one of the baby photos of the internet. The original ARPANET with just 4 nodes in December of 1969. Operated at a whopping 2.4K bits per second, later 50K. Here's the ARPANET in 1971. It grew pretty rapidly. Here's a series of milestones. In particular, the late 80s growth really accelerated, essentially doubling in 1989 in size. Here's some more old photos of the ARPANET. So back in the old days, there was a time where there wasn't internet service providers because it was all government and education and research. 87 was UUNet was founded. I remember that. The NSF net backbone is upgraded to T1s. I remember that. NFS backbone got upgraded to T3s in '92. I also remember that. All right. So transmission control protocol, internet protocol. You've heard of it. It's used for today's internet. What you probably didn't know is that TCP/IP dates back to 1973 for the initial development of it. It's a long time. It replaced ARPANET NCP. And you've probably also heard that there's another version of TCP/IP out there called IPv6. There's actually 2 separate internets. So You hear the term IP address. What is an IP address? It's basically just a unique identifier. Depends on which protocol version you're talking about. V4 addresses look like that standard dotted quad that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and V6 addresses are just much bigger and more intimidating and essentially impossible for you to remember unless you're very strange. You need IP addresses to connect devices to the internet, generally. And you need a lot of IP addresses if you have a lot of devices. So yes, there really are two separate internets. The V4 internet is what most people, particularly most residential users, think about as being the normal internet. There's really not a whole lot wrong with the IPv4 internet other than we're essentially out of address space. I'll talk more about that later. And today there's a lot of end-to-end reachability issues because we started using NAT and PAT in the 90s, network address translation and port address translation, to deal with the fact that we're running out of IP addresses. So they came out with IPv6 19 years ago, and you could say the uptake's been a little slow. So if you're a small business or a residential person, you get your IP addresses from your internet provider. They give them to you. You can request a static IP or a subnet, particularly if you're a business, and you can generally get these from your internet service provider. Sometimes they want to charge you a fee, a one-time fee or a monthly fee. Typical monthly fee is somewhere in the $5 a month per IP address range, or maybe $100 for a small subnet, something like that. That's what you do if you're residential small business. So again, IPv4 came out in '83 implementation. It's 32-bit addressing. It is, in fact, exhausted, as they say, meaning we ran out of IP addresses several years ago, officially. That doesn't mean that there aren't IP addresses, and we'll get to that. Some other things about IPv4, which I won't go into, but you should certainly research on your own if you have to deal with this, is there's a number of reserved blocks out there that are only for use for internal networks or for testing purposes. There's even address blocks reserved strictly for network documentation and diagrams for things like people who write books or do practice labs and so forth. IPv6, 1998, 128-bit addressing, extremely large, ludicrously large, essentially, supposedly, will never run out. Why do we need IPv6? Well, we primarily need it for the dreaded Internet of Things. We're going to have so many devices talking to so many things that they're all going to need IPs. So, address fees. So, you can get your own addresses if you're a business in particular, although I've certainly seen individuals actually purchase their own IP addresses. Here in the United States, we get them from ARIN, the American Registry of Internet Numbers. And there's a fee, an annual fee, associated with them. For a small block, it's, $250 a year. Goes up from there, becomes pretty large. There's other regional internet registries like RIPE and APNIC and others, where you can get IPs. There's a lot of IPv6 addresses. You can get as many IPv6 addresses as you want, essentially no problem at all. IPv4 is where the issue is currently. Depending on which area of the world you live in or which agreement you signed from which registry operator, address blocks can be legally owned and treated as property, except in the U.S. with ARIN. If you've signed their recent agreements, then essentially you're just licensing the IP blocks. There is, in fact, a special marketplace now where you can buy and sell IP blocks today. So right now in the market, if you can prove justification that you need a /24, which is 255 IPv4 addresses, that's essentially the minimum that any small to medium business would want to purchase in terms of internet routing. That cost is about $5,000 on the market, all fees included, roughly, these days. The cost is going up. The smaller the transactions, the higher the fees. And people believe we haven't actually seen the top of the market yet. There's folks I know with blocks of IPs that are waiting for the prices to go up before they sell them. So IPv6. So if you have a smartphone, more than likely, if you're on AT&T or Verizon, two of the larger national carriers, your smartphone, when it's operating on cellular, you only have an IPv6 address. They do not give you an IPv4 address because they don't have enough of them. So they use translation mechanisms like NAT64 to allow you to reach the v4 internet from the v6 internet. People are still lagging on IPv6 implementation, even though it's been on by default in Windows Vista and Server 2008. And I think all of you should be aware that if you're not specifically configuring IPv6, it's probably still enabled and it's gone into auto-config mode, and you have an interesting set of vulnerabilities and risk exposure that I won't go into in this talk because you're not managing your IPv6. And it was optional in XP and Server 2003. So again, IPv6 adoption is going slowly, but it's accelerating. Google now says it's roughly 14% of all of their traffic. You can see that graph has, things have improved quite a bit in the last 5 years. Akamai has this information published from various sources of IPv6 traffic to their servers, and you can see that some of the large carriers like T-Mobile, most of the traffic they see from those networks are all IPv6, and that's because of mobile devices, primarily. All right, so you have IP addresses. What do you do with your addresses? Well, they have to be routed. And routing is just the act of connecting different IP subnets together to form a larger network or an internet or the internet. And the routers are the device that do that. Typically, you'd buy them from companies like Cisco or Juniper. These days, you can run software stacks on commodity hardware. There's all sorts of open source BGP implementations. Some of them are quite good. Depending on your needs, you can spend $500, you can spend $500,000. Seriously. And you say, why is there such a wide range in that price tag? Well, it comes down to how much traffic are you putting through that router? Are you talking about a router that will handle a 100 megabit connection, or a router that's going to handle, 4 terabits? How redundant is that piece of equipment? How many fan trays? How many power supplies? So on and so forth. Makes a big difference. Also depends on, which teal-colored vendor you're purchasing the equipment from. Same thing with firewalls, and again, this is basic for most of you guys. Firewall is just a specialized device that controls access between 2 or more separate IP networks, sometimes including routing. And primarily, firewall is there to implement some sort of policy, some sort of administrative policy, where you're trying to deny some sort of traffic or monitor some sort of traffic or otherwise control that traffic. Maybe you're trying to QoS it. Maybe you have IP phones and you want to make sure that that traffic goes first on the network. Very often the firewall is doing some sort of NAT and PAT due to v4 limited addresses. And again, there's a variety of vendors out there ranging from small home, small office to large enterprise. And again, you can spend as much as you want, essentially, on a firewall. As I will tell most small to medium businesses that if they're purchasing all of their equipment at Staples, you're doing it wrong. You need to buy something bigger. All right. So IP transit, what's that? So that's what you're buying from your internet service provider. It is access to the internet, meaning that they are transiting your traffic everywhere on the internet and back to you. This is what everybody thinks about as being internet access, sometimes called dedicated internet access, DIA, by some vendors. Nearly everybody and pretty much most businesses and virtually all residential customers buy IP transit, and you get your IP addresses that way, oftentimes, which can be a problem. So if you're going to be on the internet, and you're going to be routing on the internet, you need an autonomous system number, which is essentially just a unique identifier for your organization on the internet under a common control and management policy. Every network operator has to have an ASN. Now, a lot of folks don't have an ASN. Even reasonably large businesses don't have ASNs, meaning that they're actually using their internet provider's ASN. You can get an ASN pretty easily. It's just some paperwork to fill out, $550 one-time fee, $250 annual fee. So if you don't have an autonomous system number, again, you're using your internet provider. They are routing your traffic to you. So here's a selection of some fairly common AS numbers. And for network engineers, particularly folks that deal with the internet all day, this is like reading the matrix. I can actually look at sometimes PCAPs and certainly BGP information, and I am more easily able to identify where the traffic is going based on the AS number than by name. Microsoft is 8075, Apple's 714, so forth and so on. Even the SANS Institute has their own AS number for their corporate office. So what do you do with an AS number? Well, there's this routing protocol called Border Gateway Protocol, which is what all these routers are running to exchange information, basically tell each other about all these different routes and where they are. If you are not running BGP and you don't have an AS, you're not a network operator in internet terms. You are what's called a customer or an end user. And I've seen over the years a lot of, say, web hosting operations or even some data centers, hosting companies that say, oh, yes, we have this excellent internet connectivity and we have such amazing connections and so forth, and then you actually find out that they don't even run BGP themselves, and it's just a service that they're buying from AT&T or Level 3 or something like that. So they're not actually operating their own network. They're buying that network from somebody else. It's more and more common for large enterprises and certainly nearly all institutions, which includes a lot of hospitals and educational institutions, to be running BGP themselves and establish multiple internet and peering connections for redundancy and performance and lower cost. So BGP routing has grown over the years. This is 28 years of growth of the IPv4 routing table. As with most graphs associated with the internet, it goes up and to the right at a 45-degree angle. And that's pretty much most internet graphs at a certain scale. So this is showing that there's well over 600,000 individual IPv4 routes on the internet. It's actually more like 700 and something thousand if you don't filter at any level and include everything, including stuff that should never be on the internet, like /32s and so forth. Here's a graph of the last, since 96, of unique ASNs. This is worldwide. So there's over 55,000 entities worldwide that are participating in the internet. And that entity can range in size from literally a single person who's probably a network engineer of too much time on his hands, who sets something up for himself at his house. I have seen this. I have not done this, but I've seen it done. And that, again, it's schools, educational institutions, nonprofits, internet providers, carriers, content providers, hosting companies, so forth and so on, banks, hospitals, enterprises of all sorts. But there's only 55,000 of them worldwide. I do have to mention BGP has security issues. There are a lot of good papers and a lot of good talks about the security implications of BGP. This is not one of them. We've got transitive trust issues. There's no real chain of authority to validate address announcements. And one thing that used to happen quite a lot, happens a little bit less now, is that bad guys can hijack allocated addresses that aren't being used and start announcing them themselves, typically in Russia or somewhere in Asia, where people aren't really paying that much attention. And then they're able to use that set of address blocks to either send spam or run a command and control network or whatever sort of nefarious purpose. And then when they're done, they just stop announcing it. And sometimes it's difficult to actually find out where that was coming from and who it was coming from. There's also been plenty of discussion and proof of concepts and actual events around man-in-the-middle attacks. There was a good one at DEF CON 16. You can go find that on YouTube. So here's one example of a BGP incident that occurred back in 2004. And a lot of BGP issues are actually all because of the humans. It really is, unfortunately. There are more and more networks getting automated provisioning and DevOps-style network approaches, but very often when there is an issue, it's because of a human that fat-fingered something, typoed something, had an incomplete config, so forth. So December 24th, 2004, this Turkish ISP TTNet made a misconfiguration. They basically said, I'm the best way to get to the internet for most of the internet. And one of their upstreams, Telecom Italia, said, okay, and just started passing along that information. So as a result, large sections of the internet were unreachable for several hours that morning until fixed by humans. And there's a whole write-up on that incident. And that's just one incident out of many, many incidents over the years. We have less and less real catastrophic incidents, at least it seems to me in the last 5 years. But and there's also been some very interesting studies out there about correlating network outage incidents to whether or not it's a Friday or a Monday. Which day of the week is it most likely that you're going to have a network outage due to a human error, so forth and so on. All right. Peering. What's that? Peering is when you have two autonomous systems, two ASNs, that agree to connect somewhere, mutually agreeable place, with some sort of technology and some sort of speed for the purpose of exchanging BGP routes with each other. This is nearly always done on a settlement-free basis where each entity shares the cost of getting to that location to do the interconnect. If you peer with somebody else's network, it means you're able to reach them and they can reach you without going out to the regular internet, but you don't have access to the internet as a whole. So you're just agreeing that we're going to interconnect and I'm going to get your routes, you're going to get my routes, and we're going to exchange traffic. And there's lots and lots of entities that do this all over the place. It can be done in private facilities, telecom hotels, data centers, and so forth. Very often done at a public internet exchange facility. So let's talk a little bit more about service providers. So historically, different telecom carriers represented themselves as being a tier 1 carrier or maybe a tier 2 carrier or a tier 3 carrier. It was supposed to be some sort of proxy for how good they were. In reality, it was mostly just marketing, as most things are, particularly in the carrier world. So a tier 1 is, they are the national, international backbone operators. That they don't pay anybody else for IP transit. And this is really the only thing that really determines what a tier 1 is. So there really is this club of carriers worldwide that they don't pay anyone. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have costs. They have tons of costs. They have all kinds of facilities to operate. They have staff. They have electric bills, fiber, all that stuff. But they're not writing a check every month to an upstream internet provider. And this is mostly due to their size, although in a lot of cases it's due to historical purposes. It's things that happened in the 80s and 90s leading to today. So here's an example of Some of these carriers that are considered to be Tier 1 because they don't pay anybody else, so AT&T, CenturyLink, Cogent, Level 3, Sprint, Telecom Italia, Zayo, Verizon Enterprise, and others. And there's even more if you really start going into the international side of things. So the Tier 1s, they've been called a cabal. They work very hard to create barriers of entry to prevent anybody else from becoming a Tier 1 because they want to get your money. So they set up things such as, you must peer with us on 5 continents. You must connect to us at 7 different locations. You must meet a minimum traffic volume of X gigabit per second, so forth and so on. My main point is that buying internet connectivity from a Tier 1 carrier does not necessarily guarantee you good connectivity to everywhere on the internet, because the internet's a big place. Then you have Tier 2 carriers, which are typically large internet providers that have multiple peering arrangements with multiple other providers, or ASNs, but they still have to buy IP transit from somebody, some number of Tier 1s, to reach the rest of the internet that they don't peer with directly. A lot of these Tier 1 operators are actually way smaller than the Tier 2 operators, but the Tier 2 operators just haven't been able to break into the cabal yet to stop having to pay the bill. 2 carriers, Hurricane Electric and PCCW, are examples of Tier 2s that are quite large, bigger than most of the Tier 1s. Hurricane Electric's one of my favorite providers. So Tier 2s often have better connectivity than Tier 1s because their strategy is generally, we want to peer with everybody. We want to be everywhere, connect with everyone. We want direct access to as many networks as possible because then they don't have to buy as much in terms of transit. Tier 3 ISPs tend to be more rural and local. This would be the minimum viable product sort of ISP. They get 2 internet connections, usually from 2 different vendors, hopefully, although I've often seen like a small rural telephone company, they'll buy 2 connections from AT&T, and they say, yeah, we're good. We have 2 connections, and we're good to go. So in the past, Tier 3s would buy from Tier 1s. They'd order circuits, usually from a great distance, lots of cost there, and hopefully things were diverse. So you want to get on the internet. So if you're a small business, or residential, you order it from your ISP. You negotiate over a price. Usually it's more expensive than you want for the speed that you want. They deliver it to you. They give you an IPv4 address. Maybe it's just a dynamic one. Ideally, they're also giving you V6. And you get yourself some sort of firewall, and hey, you're in business. But if you want to be a little bit more advanced, you get yourself at least one IP transit circuit with an ISP. You get your own IPv4 and ideally V6 address space, either from your ISP or really you should buy it or get it from a registrar somewhere. Get your own ASN and get yourself a router that is capable of running BGP, or set up something open source and do all that work. So why would you want to go through all of that work? Why? I mean, there's got to be a reason, right? So if you have your own ASN and your own IP space, it means you are directly participating in the internet. You're not going to have interference from an upstream ISP that might be, some ISPs, particularly residential ones, are becoming fairly evil. They're injecting advertising, they're collecting data, they're engaging in non-neutral services, and they're certainly looking very much forward to new changes at the FCC to get rid of net neutrality. But if you have your own ASN and your own IP space, you can avoid vendor lock-in. You can add and remove internet providers pretty easily. You can use shorter-term contracts because you have your own IPs. You renumber into that once. You don't have to do it ever again. I have seen so many organizations, banks and hospitals and others, that continued to keep a 7-year-old circuit from a carrier they didn't even like because, it's too much work to renumber, or they don't think they can renumber, So they continue to pay really inflated prices just because it's tied to that IP address space. If you have your own ASN in your own IP space, you can join an internet exchange, or you can peer privately with others. So again, why would you want to do this other than makes things better, faster, more resilient? Well, the big reason is cost. Here's, roughly 20 years worth of wholesale IP transit costs. I can certainly remember paying well in excess of $1,200 a megabit. Today, like literally 2017, there are commercial offerings out there that are at the sub 25 cents per megabit level. Now, that's not bringing it to your building. That's a port in a data center or some sort of facility that you have to go to. And that's what all of these prices are. But by becoming part of the BGP ecosystem and playing in that world, you can buy wholesale, and the costs are just night and day. Again, you're going to have to get it back to your facility somehow. You'll have to contract with a carrier, or maybe you can lease some dark fiber from somebody. Depends on who you are. So in the old days, this is what the internet looked like. You had the folks at the top with names that were mostly telephone companies, Sprint and MCI and so forth. There were some regional access providers, and then your local ISPs all paid them, and then the customer is connected to them. In the old days, we were talking about legacy telco infrastructure speeds, N by T1 level service, DS3 service, things that are arcane that some of you have never heard of, like frame relay and asynchronous transfer mode. This is like the Elder Scrolls here. Then there was later technology, SONET systems, starting at OC3, then going all the way up to OC192. Ethernet, 100 meg. Remember when fast Ethernet came out? Man, that was awesome. No more vampire taps. A couple of you got that reference. All right. Then we had gigabit Ethernet. You realize we've had gigabit Ethernet since 1998? And 10 gig since 2002, and even 100 gig is almost 10 years old now, even though a lot of folks still have never deployed it because it's super expensive. So today, the internet backbone, well, doesn't really exist. There isn't really a single backbone anymore. There's multiple backbones, multiple providers. It's really much more of a mesh. And it's highly distributed. There's still some physical locations where things are dense. In particular, certain cities, certain buildings in certain cities. There's certain infrastructure locations in certain cities that absolutely would be a problem if they were attacked by terrorists, as an example. Technology today, primarily the internet is held together with 10 gig and 100 gig links. 200 and 400 are right now. People are starting to deploy that today. A lot of times, because 100 gig is still expensive, you have carriers deploying large numbers of LACP bundles to connect cities. I've heard stories about certain large cable operators having, 30 10 gig links lagged together in a single link to get as much capacity as they needed. We still have some SONET out there. AT&T notably has a SONET, an OC768 network, 40 gig. The other thing that happens today is we have this thing called dense wave division multiplexing, where you're getting multiple wavelengths of light over the same pair of fibers. So if you are running 100 gig, you can actually, with commercially available systems, you can put 96 100 gig wavelengths over the same pair of fibers. And today, modern fiber cables, they're very high count, 144 count, 288, even as much as 3,000 count fiber, ribbon fiber, in some locations. So there's just in a lot of places, particularly in urban areas, places like Manhattan, where it's very expensive and difficult to dig, they're putting in these ludicrous count cables. And you think each pair of those fibers you can run DWDM on top of, so you can get just ludicrous amounts of speed and capacity. That's kind of a sample diagram of how DWDM works. It's essentially just different wavelengths of light, different colors, as people say, running over the same optic. So the modern internet looks a lot more like this. You have these huge companies like Facebook, like Google, like Microsoft, that they're responsible for so many of the bits that people use. They're the giant destinations on the internet. And increasingly, particularly with companies like Akamai or Netflix, they're pushing the delivery of those bits closer and closer and closer to the customer, closer to the edge. So the internet providers are tending to connect to internet exchanges and doing either private or public peering with these content providers, so that they're not having to buy transit for those services. So as an example, if you're a residential ISP, with residential customers, at about 8 o'clock at night, pretty much anywhere in the U.S., I can tell you that half of all of your traffic will be 3 companies. Netflix will be anywhere between 30 to 40% of your network. And then you have Akamai and Google, which includes YouTube. Just those 3 companies will literally be half of all of your utilization in the evening. So if you're able to peer with those companies directly, that reduces what you have to purchase commercially, because companies like Google and Akamai and Netflix, they'll peer with anybody. You just get to a facility, you have a BGP AS and your IPs, and you have the equipment to do it, you're in business. So this has led to the rise of the Internet Exchange. So what's an Internet Exchange? I keep using that word. I think I know what it means. It's essentially just a facility. In reality, in a lot of cases, it's really just a switch fabric in a particular place that you can gain access to, usually for a low membership fee. There's some commercial facilities. A lot of them are actually run by nonprofits. You get access to the switch fabric, usually located in some sort of data center or meet-me facility or telecom hotel, and you connect, and then other people connect, and you peer with them. So again, the content delivery networks these days, they're placing physical hardware. Some companies like Cloudflare and Fastly and others, they're purchasing racks and racks and racks and putting in all sorts of disk and space and compute to serve up content so that it's less expensive for them. They don't have to haul it as far. It's also higher performance. It's lower latency. It's closer to the customer. So Internet exchanges, PeeringDB, which is a wonderful resource, they list 542 IXPs worldwide. It's essentially a database of all the hotels, data centers, other facilities. And so today, IXPs are really one of the primary ways the network operators exchange traffic. They also do some private peering. There's a lot of exchanges that are carrying in excess of 1 terabit of traffic per second every night. Some are carrying more than 5 terabits. Peering on the internet often gets political. Some providers just won't peer with each other for various business reasons, sometimes personal reasons. I literally know of situations where very large companies don't do business with each other because of a personal animosity between 2 different employees. It's really strange. As an example, Cogent refuses to peer with Hurricane Electric for IPv6. Hurricane Electric, by the way, happens to be the world's largest IPv6 provider. So if you actually want access to the entire IPv6 internet, you either have to buy a connection from Cogent and a connection from Hurricane, 2 connections, or you have to buy a connection from somebody else that peers with both of them. You cannot actually just buy a connection from either one and get access to the entire IPv6 internet, which is silly, but that's reality. So here's some of the infrastructure in the U.S., this is a map of some of the long-haul fiber routes. We have a lot of fiber in the U.S. There's a lot of submarine cables all around the world. Many of them land at the U.S., on the U.S., although given the revelations of the last several years, a lot of foreign countries have done everything they can to make sure that internet traffic does not route through the U.S. anymore. There's a lot of international submarine cables like that. And these. Here's some graphs of, this is DKIX Frankfurt, the German Internet Exchange. There's 700 ASNs there. They are routinely over 5 gigs every night. AM6, Amsterdam, 800 members. Again, they're over 5 terabits every night. DKIX actually started a bunch of other internet exchanges around the world after their success in Germany. They started one here in New York just about 3 years ago. Again, graph, 45-degree angle up and to the right. It's an internet graph. I love it. And I've put people here at DKIX myself. Locally, I don't know who's here that's local Indianapolis. There's the Midwest IX here in Indianapolis. It's 26 members. They're running 4 gigs, 5 gigs every night. Here's an example of what a small ISP connectivity graph looks like. All those little circles there are AS numbers. This happens to be one of my clients. They just have 2 upstreams. Yeah, pretty simple. If you could read it, you could understand it better. That's Amazon. 269 peers. You really can't figure that out. Very quickly, Anycasting of services. So here, this is a technique for how the internet scales. You announce an IP subnet in multiple locations on the internet at the same time. The routers make decisions to steer the traffic to the best or nearest instance of that address, used for things like root DNS servers and some things like Google's 8.8.8.8, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. That's not a single server. That's a bunch of servers and a bunch of locations. Just like root DNS servers, there's 13 routes, 12 operators. They are not individual servers. They're clusters with load balancers and many Anycast instances. In fact, some of the root servers have as many as 160 physically separate instances around the world. This is to ensure that you can always resolve DNS names. By having Anycast, particularly for DNS, it allows scaling of traffic volume, increasing the resiliency and redundancy, particularly against directed attacks, like DDoS attacks. So if you have 160 instances of a server somewhere on the internet and somebody decides they want to launch a DDoS, well, that's great. They might be able to knock out Ashburn or something like that, but they're not going to knock out all 160 instances because they just can't. The routing won't let them. A lot of times, Anycast root instances are located at internet exchanges. So Anycasting improves the reliability via geographic diversity, improves performance, makes it more resilient to DDoS attacks because of those multiple locations, increases the availability. If a cluster needs to go down for maintenance or something like that, you withdraw the route, your traffic's just automatically rerouted to the next better place. And very quickly some internet speed graphs there. That top line in green, which I know is hard to read, that's South Korea. That is currently the best place in the world for internet access. It's almost all fiber. It's very, very fast. They've done a good job there. Here's our average peak speeds. This is all from the Akamai State of the Internet report, which I highly recommend if you have any interest in this stuff. It's filled with useful data. Here I took some sample data of different states: California, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Maine, U.S. as a whole. So I don't know what happened to Ohio, man. I don't see Nunatari in here. I was going to harass him. But clearly, we could do a better job of providing internet access in this country. I have a bunch of statistics, which I'll just gloss over. You can look at this if you're interested in the presentation. Snapshot of what the internet looks like these days. Cisco has this very interesting global internet forecast they update every year. They actually try to do a good job of predicting what the internet's going to look like in terms of traffic volume. They're saying 26 billion network devices online by 2020. They also anticipate that basically broadband speeds are going to double between 2015 and 2020, hopefully. And no surprise to anybody that IP video is really going to represent most internet traffic by bit volume. So here we are. So why is the internet still working? Well, thankfully we have Moore's Law. Increased RAM CPU for routers at increasingly low cost. We've had more and more compute resources to handle the growth of routing tables and just the growth of traffic. We have silicon that can handle 100 gig interfaces today, 400 gig interfaces. You couldn't handle a 100 gig interface for any amount of money 15 years ago. There was nothing that could do it. We've also had technology that's had incremental speed increases, so we didn't have to completely rip and replace. We've been able to upgrade SONET systems from OC3 to OC768. We've gone from 100 meg fast Ethernet to 100 gig, and it's still essentially Ethernet. I mean, it's different, but over the years you were able to buy new switches and new routers where maybe you had the option of you can buy that really expensive upgrade card and, well, now you've got 10 gig ports, or you can buy that other really expensive upgrade card, now you have 100 gig ports. You didn't have to replace the entire box to do it. The other big reason is the fiber optic cable investment from so many carriers, including many, many submarine cables around the world, and new technologies that have allowed us to get more speeds out of that same cable. Dense wave division multiplexing has been a big thing for a lot of carriers. Particularly back in the 80s, a lot of carriers were literally running 4 fibers. They would run hundreds of miles of fiber and have 4 fibers in it because they never thought they need anything more than that. A lot of that fiber is limited, but DWDM and similar technology has allowed them to extend the life of that and have to avoid a lot of costly builds. The decentralization of services and content because of things like Anycast, scalable root DNS infrastructure, internet exchanges providing local access, and really the build-out of data centers worldwide by CDNs. I think Facebook has something like 14 data centers worldwide. Google probably has a similar number. And these are not small facilities. They are enormous facilities with lots of resources. By having those worldwide facilities, they can continue to scale out the internet with geographic load distribution. But really, the number one reason I think the internet continues to work is because of the humans. We will it to continue to operate. There's the Internet Engineering Task Force and various network operator groups like NANOG, which are mostly comprised of passionate volunteers, very much like the open source world. Now, yes, there are folks that get paid by their employer to go to these meetings, and that's wonderful, but they have a passion for it. They're not, you don't get paid to go to IETF meetings because you're bored. You do that because you love it. So because of those folks and the conferences that they run, sharing of best practices, things like BCP 38, look it up. It's in the bibliography here. And they invent and deploy new solutions to problems, and really that's what's kept the internet functional these last 20 years. And I have a few pages of bibliography. This slide deck will be available very shortly. I may have a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has any, if you're not reeling from the amount of information that I just threw at you. Yes. Yes. So the question was, have I heard of the phrase of Amazon is the hard drive of the internet? Yeah, there's, even this year we've seen some US East 1 outages for various reasons. It seems like US East 1 has some sort of an outage at least once a year. Yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure that depends on that. I know that some of that is because there are some things that if you don't specify a region when you go to create certain objects, it defaults to that region, which is probably bad. I think a lot of companies, there's a lot of startups that are 100% virtual. They're in the cloud. And that's great. The cloud can give you all sorts of savings and reduce staff and reduce capital expense. But again, it's somebody else's computer. If your business depends on it, maybe you want to have another location. Maybe you want to at least be in a different region if you're on AWS. Or hopefully maybe you buy services from some other provider in another geographic location and you practice alternating back and forth. And you do all the work necessary to get your operation to the point that you can run out of either instance seamlessly. That's what the real guys are doing. Yes. Yep. Yes. Yeah, so peering directly with AWS or Azure. Yes, like Microsoft calls that direct route, I believe, or express route or some other marketing name. Yes, and you can do a similar thing with Amazon where you can pay them money to get direct access into AWS. But you have to pay, and in both cases you're paying a port fee plus usually a bit fee, which may be small, but it adds up over time. You're going to see more and more of that. There's certainly organizations that are so heavily into something like Azure that it makes sense for them. I know of a healthcare organization in my state where they connected directly to Azure because they have so many VMs, and it just made sense for them to do it. It's not cheap. They're paying way more money than they would pay for transit. They're paying something like 10 grand a month just for that connection. And it's not even a fast connection. It's like a gig connection. In my world, that's not fast. But it makes sense if you have certain kinds of workloads. That's another reason, again, to peer and go into internet exchanges, is that for things like Microsoft, like if you're just running Office 365, you're in the cloud with email with Office 365, you don't have to pay for ExpressRoute for that. You can actually just peer with Microsoft and get closer and faster access to your email and to your apps. So I think you're going to see more of that in the future. There's also another thing happening with some of these internet exchanges, particularly the multi-country ones, where, like at DKIX, you can peer in New York, and then for a small additional fee, they will transport you on a VLAN over to Frankfurt. And you can peer in Frankfurt with like 100 meg or a gig or whatever, very inexpensively compared to what it costs to buy transatlantic. Although these days transatlantic is cheaper than ever. It's sub $5,000 a month now to go to Europe at 10 gig from the East Coast. Yes. So that's those are the nighttime graphs. The internet is very cyclical, and you can actually see. I can actually look at. Like this graph here. That's over time. That's over a period of years, and that particular graph would reflect more entities coming and going, or some seasonal variations. There certainly are seasonal variations in traffic. But if you look at like a one-day graph, like this right here, this is all they made available at Midwest IX. Obviously, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., there's lower traffic because, well, most rational people are asleep at 4 a.m. But there's always something running. There's automated processes. There's backups. There's, sync services like Carbonite and, all those sort of backup to the cloud, that consumes a lot of bandwidth in the background. 5 years, yeah. I don't know if I had any other bandwidth graphs. I mean, there's the cost of bandwidth over time. I love that graph. Oh, yeah, oh, yes, okay, I know. So that is really just a data collection issue that didn't get cleaned up. And yeah, there's noise in this data. There's a lot less noise these days, but early on, back before, there's actually entire organizations, there's entire research departments at some universities and some nonprofits that are funded. Their entire job is just to do research on the internet and collect statistics now. Back in the late 90s, that didn't exist. It was a lot of it was volunteers, so that's why there's those sort of errors. Anyone else? All right. Well, I hope I kept you reasonably entertained and maybe you learned something. And feel free, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. Clearly, I'm one of those geeks that likes it. Thank you.